All right. Good evening. This is the regular meeting of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group meeting for January 5th, 2021.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statutes section 13D.021 due to the declared local health pandemic. For the record, my name is Jill Garcia, and I am one of the co-chairs of this Charter Commission's Government Structure Work Group. I will now call this meeting to order and ask that the clerk call the roll so we may verify the presence of quorum.
Commissioner Ginder.
Present.
Commissioner Metke.
Present.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commission Chair Clegg.
Here.
Co-Chair Abbott.
Here.
Co-Chair Garcia.
Present.
There are 6 members present.
Let the record reflect we have a quorum. We will now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access on the city's legislative information management system, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. Commissioners, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
In a second. Great. Is there any discussion before the clerk calls the roll? Okay, seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the motion for today's agenda.
Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Metke.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commission Chair Clegg.
Aye.
Co-Chair Abbott.
Aye.
Co-Chair Garcia.
Aye.
There are 6 ayes.
Motion passes and the agenda is adopted. Now for agenda item 3 is receiving and filing a presentation from representatives of the city of Duluth. And the city of Duluth is a city of the first class, which is a technical term meaning that they are of a certain size. The 3 other cities besides Minneapolis and St. Paul that are considered cities of the first class are Duluth, Rochester, and what?
St. Paul.
I'm sorry, St. Paul. There you go. And for today's meeting, we have the city of Duluth with us to talk about their government structure. We have invited City Manager Noah Schuckman and City Clerk Chelsea Hemler. So welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us. Do we have Mr. Schuckman available?
Chair Garcia and commissioners, I do know that Mr. Schuckman is attempting to join us and should be with us hopefully momentarily.
Great, thank you. Well, then just for a brief overview, we do have a list of questions that we sent to Duluth in advance. So we can go through the list of questions and some overlap and the conversation will kind of interrelate with one another. So we will just make sure that we've covered everything and see if there's anything outstanding by the time we wrap up our discussion.
So I just want to check, Madam Chair, if Mr. Schuckman has had a chance to join us. We've let in a few more calls, and so it may be that Mr. Schuckman is now with us.
Mr. Schuckman?
And he may be muted as well. In order to unmute yourself, you'll have to push *6, and then your microphone will unmute.
Mr. Shookman? Well, shall we proceed?
Well, certainly, I mean, Ms. Helmer is here, and so we could certainly speak with her. And I'll try to reach out to Mr. Shookman and see if I can reach him in the meantime.
Thank you. And if you don't get a chance to announce him,
I actually have just admitted Mr. Shookman to the meeting, so I'll just give it a minute and to make sure that he can hear us. So Mr. Shookman, if you're on the line, if you can just let us know.
I can hear you. Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Thanks.
hi, welcome. I'm Jill Garcia. I'm the co-chair of the Government Structure Work Group. I will be facilitating tonight. Greg Abbott is my other co-chair. And we met Ms. Helmer. We were going to start by going through the questions that we had sent you in advance. And when we wrap up this discussion, we'll just make sure that we hit on anything, because I'm sure the questions will kind of roll into one another as we go along. So thank you for joining us. The first question is to ask you to briefly describe your mayor council administrator structure and how you would rate just qualitatively the effectiveness and efficiency of your structure, including the biggest attributes and perhaps the biggest drawbacks.
Sure. Thank you. I will, if it's okay, I will start, and Chelsea, please do chime in here. The mayor in the city of Duluth, it's a strong mayor system. It does have a city administrator, and I serve in that role. The way that the structure is set up and the way we functionally operate it is that with the exception of the city attorney, all of the department heads report to me directly, and Ms. Helmer is one of those department heads and also serves as our city clerk. And the city attorney reports to the mayor directly and also then has a direct connection and role with the city council. And so the mayor then has a handful of office staff as well that report to her. But in terms of reporting, I report to the mayor. About 820 of our staff report to me, and then the remainder report to the mayor or to the city attorney. And the administration as a whole, as we refer to it, tends to generate the bulk of our council agenda. That those items are brought to the council for approval or discussion, and it's the full gamut of city operations. And I will maybe let Ms. Helmer chime in here and talk it through from a more technical standpoint about what items come to the council and why, and also just her perspective on this, because she is a much more technical expert on it than I am.
Yeah, Chair Garcia and Commissioners, I would add, so as you are probably aware, as you're gathering information as part of this work group and that strong mayor council form, effectively in the city of Duluth, the council has the legislative and budgetary authority. So they are the overall policymakers oftentimes, and then they do determine the budget for the city of Duluth. And then the administrative branch is really operates as an executive branch, similar to what you see in the federal government. They have the full authority to enforce then those laws and policies and to execute those budgetary decisions. It does positive attributes. I think that executive authority allows the city to respond quickly to items that are, or to events that are happening in the community. But at the same time, then it allows the council to focus on sometimes some of the larger picture. Of course, the administration does make all of the budgetary recommendations to the council, but it does allow the council to have some decision-making process when it comes to overarching taxation policy, et cetera. So it provides some flexibility for government. There's still an element to that bigger picture policy making, decision making that's happening at the council level.
Jill, you're on mute.
How long has this specific structure been in place?
Duluth City Charter was adopted in 1956, or was amended to its current form in 1956. There have been some amendments to the charter, but the overall structure of government has not changed since that time.
Okay, wow. As we go on to the second question, I want to invite work group members and other charter commissioners who may have a question to use that raised hand feature as we're having this discussion. The second question is about how the city actually works kind of in real life, as opposed to how it's designed in the charter. And for example, how is direction given by the mayor, by the council, as well as to and from individual council members?
So I will start, Chelsea, if that's all right with you. Thank you for the question. So by and large, the way that it works is that, and I referenced this earlier in my kind of opening comments, but by and large, the department heads and each of the departments reports to me, and so that direction comes from me. Certainly, the mayor is the ultimate authority in the city, and she and I work very closely together to make sure that we are aligned. The way that I often summarize the work that we do is that the mayor focuses her attention 75% of the time outside of the building on bigger picture, community-wide things, and leaves the operational side to me. And I spend 75% of my time on internal city operational work, and then the other 25% external, and the mayor spends about 25% of her time internally working on operational things. And that's certainly a pretty fluid dynamic, but we work very closely together, as I do then with our department heads. We work very closely with counselors to make sure that there's an understanding from the council that when they have constituent requests or concerns or specific projects that they want to go through, that our expectation is that they work through either myself or a department head, rather than going directly to line staff. And that is purely to make sure that we're able to keep those lines of authority, I guess is the best way to put it, clear and as not confusing as possible to line staff. And so I work extensively with counselors. Director Helmer does as well, as do our other department heads. And the one that they work, the other administration staff person they work very closely with is the city attorney, who represents the council as well as the administration. And so Chelsea, I don't know if there's anything specific that you want to add. I'm happy also to answer conflicts about direction before I hand it off to Chelsea. I don't personally think there are conflicts about direction. We have worked very hard to make those lines of communication and lines of the chain of command clear. And we have very good and positive relationships with counselors as we work that through. And if and when there is a bump in that road, it's usually a pretty calm and simple conversation that I have with them or that a department head has with them. Personalities certainly do play a role, but position and formal process tend to carry the day. And I'll hand it off to Chelsea here for any comments.
Yeah, I would, the only thing I would note is there are some provisions that are in the city charter that actually do prohibit the counselors from particularly around areas of employment, directing hire, fire, employment, but also then directing employees in daily work tasks. So that does, per the charter, have to flow through the mayor and the city administrator.
Thank you very much. There is the part 2 of this, but I would like to acknowledge the 2 people who, and actually work group members who've raised their hands. Peter Ginder.
Thank you. This is a question probably most directed to Noah. Noah, Peter Ginder. So it's nice to virtually see you, but I'm interested in the comparison of how the city works with regard to resident or citizen complaints. In Minneapolis, one of both the strengths of the system is that neighborhoods and people who live in the city feel that they have easy access to government by calling their local council member. That also is one of the probably the weaknesses of it, is because council members then tend to, some might say, interfere with the delivery of services, whether it's public works or the police department or whatever. I'm calling up and asking for specific responses in their ward. It sounds like that's not possible in Duluth with your prohibition against this kind of contact, but is there the same feeling of responsiveness and connectedness to the government in Duluth as you might find in Minneapolis?
Thank you, Peter. Nice to see you. I apologize, my camera is not working this evening. And I'm glad that the city of Minneapolis was able to continue to avail itself of your services after retirement, Peter. That's great news. For folks who I don't know on the call, and I know a number of the people on the call, I served 15 years for the city of Minneapolis until fall of 2018, the last 3 years as department head for the Regulatory Services Department. But my first 5 years at the city of Minneapolis were as a policy aide to council member Gary Schiff. And so I have seen both sides of this. And I actually started at the city of Minneapolis before the 311 system was in place. And I mentioned that in part because, to your point, Peter, I personally saw a big shift in constituent relations and how complaints were handled before and after the implementation of 311 at the city of Minneapolis. And at the city of Duluth, we do not have a 311 system. And that's something actually that Chelsea and I have talked about. And Chelsea and her staff are working on the potential implementation of that. As it stands right now, the city of Duluth has 4 at-large counselors, which is one of the big differences between Minneapolis and Duluth. And so we have we have council members that they obviously have their own email address, and then there's an email address that serves as a distribution list to all of the city council. And so one of the things that we work through is that that ends up being one of the main focal points for complaints. So very frequently, all 9 counselors see all the complaints. And so we're working to try to take some steps out of that process, not to cut out counselors, but to get resolution of those complaints more directly to the line staff that can address them. But certainly residents and visitors do reach out to the council. Those complaints then tend to come directly to either me or to the department head as the initial kind of triage of those. We also have staff in my office and the mayor's office who answer kind of a general city phone line, and they also triage complaints directly by phone. And then we have a city website that does have some ability to take complaints via form submission. And so, you know, it's fairly ad hoc, and it has pluses and minuses. But when things come to counselors, we work very hard to get to start the process of answering those questions proactively. And you know, the district counselors that represent a specific geographic area of the city, I think they tend to get more direct complaints that then they turn around and come to us on. But what we end up having right now is I think a fairly inefficient process where there's a lot of hands that touch a complaint before it gets to the staff person who goes out in the field and fills that pothole, for example. That a pothole complaint could go to all 9 counselors, and then from multiple counselors and or the mayor to me, to the department, the public works director, and then the public works director, his staff fill the pothole, let him know, and then that chain repeats itself going backwards. And obviously, you know, that level of contact is really valuable for a constituent to get service, but it's not a very efficient way to do it. And I think that what we would like to find a way to do is to just make that a little bit more of a direct connection. And I remember in Minneapolis, the C-Click Fix app and using 311 allowed for much more direct access. And so I think that's a real benefit to the city of Minneapolis, and something that I would like us to get to in Duluth. And so I don't know if I've missed a piece of your question. I certainly would like Chelsea to chime in as well.
I would add that I think I don't think it limits constituents to your original question, Peter. The way the structure is formatted, I don't think it limits citizens' access to counselors or counselors' ability to potentially influence how services are delivered. It does provide, I think it allows NOAA, the city administrator, to maybe control the workflow a little more, because there isn't, I think, a pressure from an employee perspective. Well, I just was contacted by Counselor X, and so I need to set aside our work plan here to get to this right away. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case in Minneapolis. But it does allow kind of the department heads and the city administrator to maybe structure a work plan and then work with the counselor to make sure that the constituent's issue is addressed.
Thank you. I think that answered my question.
Thank you. We'll move on to Chris Smith, and then we also have a question in the chat that I will read when Chris is wrapped up.
All right, I had a couple different questions. I think Noah just answered some of them. I was kind of curious about the makeup of the Duluth City Council and whether it was by ward or at large, and those were answered. I guess I was wondering, I assume that the council members are all part-time, that most of them have other jobs that are their full-time. Is the mayor considered a full-time position in the city?
You are
correct.
How much? I'm sorry.
I guess I was just wondering if she was, normally at City Hall, or if she has another job as well.
So the mayor is full-time and works out of her office in City Hall. The council is part-time. They all have other jobs, or do other things. And they, by and large, do not work out of City Hall other than in normal times, a council meeting, or if they're meeting with staff or with a constituent in the building, using the building as office space. But by and large, having worked in Minneapolis for all those years, that is a major difference in terms of the elected official presence in City Hall, is that we have 1 full-time elected official and 9 who are not.
All right. And then my other question, and Chelsea had kind of mentioned it, you talked about there's kind of a prohibition from council members dealing directly with city employees. And actually, we were provided that charter provision in one of the memos that we had. And I was just kind of curious, it actually says in in the charter provision that it's a misdemeanor. I don't know if that's meant to be criminal or not. And then it talks about a counselor being removed. And I guess I'm just kind of curious if anyone has ever tried to actually invoke that provision. And it also seems to me it talks about you can't give someone an order. I would think there would be oftentimes difficulty. What is an order versus having a conversation with someone and perhaps urging them to do something? But has that ever come up before?
I will I'll just say very briefly, we do not run into problems that I have heard with counselors giving orders to staff, and that has not been an issue. Chelsea has worked for the city longer than I have, and so I will hand that off to her, and she may know more about a history of that, but it has been not an issue during my time.
Yeah, I am trying to think back historically. I do not recall where that has directly been an issue with a particular counselor. We do review that provision, the city clerk's office, in addition to the city attorney, with counselors when we go over orientation. I think effectively it's just a reminder for counselors to work with the city administrator, and then by extension the department directors. But I don't recall where there has been an attempt to directly enforce that provision.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. Did you have anything else? No. When people turn off their cameras, that's a good indication.
No, I don't.
Next, we did get a question in the chat from Andrea Rubenstein, who's a commissioner. And for folks who have joined us, again, I invite people to use the raise hand function. Andrea's question is from a policy issue perspective, rather than constituent services, with the prohibition on the council member interference with or direct supervision of staff, is there ever an issue where more flexibility would be desirable or necessary? And Commissioner Rubenstein, feel free to clarify or add a follow-up if you would like.
So I'm happy to answer if there is a follow-up or any additional information. In my experience, we have not needed additional flexibility. From a policy standpoint, counselors tend to start either with me or with the city attorney. If not with me, then with the department head. The city attorney's office, if it is something that so I think one of the dynamics that's important to note is that the counselors don't have to work with the administration directly on a policy initiative. They certainly can bring something forward, counselor driven. They would work with either their colleagues or the city attorney to craft something like that. But by and large, those things tend to be done in coordination with the administration, and that tends to then start with either me or the department head. And I work very closely with the department heads. We tend to be all on the same page about what's happening and when. But I don't see a need for additional flexibility. Chelsea, as a department head and as our city clerk, may have a different opinion, and so certainly I would welcome her to chime in and share that if she does.
No, I would second Noah's comments. I think once kind of that, if a counselor is choosing to work with the administration on a policy initiative effectively, there's still room for that counselor then to work directly to get feedback, input, work with a department head about what is that going to look like in practicality, how are we going to implement it. As Noah mentioned, the counselors don't need to do that, but in the interest of effective government, that's generally the vast majority of the time they will. And so employees still have the ability to work with a counselor in that way. It's just that provision in my mind is just more of keeping that line of where the executive authority rests versus the policymaking and budgetary authority.
Thank you. I asked that question because the charter language looked so inflexible that it worried me, but you've answered it, so thank you for that.
The next question, and perhaps this is a bit redundant from conversation we just had, but it's about the separation of the executive and legislative. And if that separation and the importance of that separation in defining the roles of mayor and council and the administrative staff. Do you have any response to that?
I think it does promote accountability. I certainly, as I've said, I report directly to the mayor, as does our city attorney and some of her staff. And then our department heads report directly to me. We do, just like Minneapolis does, we do performance reviews. I meet every other week typically with department heads to just make sure that we're all on the same page. We meet as a leadership team right now during the pandemic. We meet weekly. Historically, we have met every other week as a leadership team, and it's a very functional and I think really well working team. And so, we have typical civil service rules and contract collective bargaining agreements that govern accountability up and down the line. But in terms of accountability to the council and to the mayor, I find that to be pretty clear and pretty easy to work with. And I've not had any confusion about accountability and authority and who I report to and who reports to me and what my role is. And a lot of that is things that we have worked together to make sure that is clear to staff and to each other. But it certainly, I find that our system sets it up in a fairly clean way.
Okay, thank you. Greg Abbott has a question.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious in terms of, one of the things that's gotten kicked around here is what exactly is legislative and what exactly is executive. And I don't know, like for, the example that's been kicked around here is zoning and land use. And, which in my mind is clearly policymaking legislative, right? And I think the question in the Duluth system, I presume the city council still votes on like variances and zoning changes and whatnot. But I guess the larger question is have you guys ever had any friction, or have there been any discussions or disputes about what goes in the legislative hopper and what goes in the executive hopper, and how does that work in practice?
Thank you for the question. So much like Minneapolis, Duluth has a planning commission, as well as planning and zoning staff that do the preliminary work. There are certainly items, whether it's a variance or an appeal, that come through the council. And so some items are administratively handled because that's what the way that the ordinance is written or the structure is set up, and some things come through for the same reason, come through the council. There are certain I believe it's in ordinance, and Chelsea will be able to more definitively answer this, but there are items in ordinance that require specific things to come to the council, whether it's a specific dollar amount for expenditure, I believe that is the biggest one, or ordinance changes, certain resolutions that do need to come through. And so I don't personally find there to be a lot of confusion. I have not seen an instance where we have handled something administratively that then the council has said, we wish that would come through. We tend to err on the side of sending things through the council when in doubt. And frankly, there's just not that much aside from day-to-day operations that doesn't come through the council in some form. And so I'll hand it off to Chelsea to add to or clarify anything that I missed.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of that detail, and I think probably areas where there maybe does need to be some clarity ends up being dealt with through the city code. So a lot of times that will, I think, refine maybe what we consider executive versus legislative. And of course, all of that, everything that is adopted or codified in the code comes to council. So a lot of times it will originate from administration. So specifically what came to mind when we were talking planning and zoning is, I believe it was in 2010, the city undertook a process to adopt a new zoning code, the Unified Development Chapter. And so that was, a consultant, city worked with a consultant. That was all done at the administrative level. But then that Unified Development Chapter was then brought forward to the council for them to adopt effectively as law. So there's that balance there of oftentimes administration will have to kind of go into that detail work, but if the council has a concern or feels like that should be something where the council should have that vested authority, that will oftentimes get delineated then in the city code.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a little bit of a follow-up question on kind of that in our conversation so far. And for those who are not, who don't have the camera necessarily, there's been questions in the chat to clarify the composition. The mayor is full-time and the council is part-time. There are not 9 council members, 5 elected at a district-wide level and 4 at large. So my question is, do you think that this operation would run differently if the council was full-time? Do you think that being a part-time council kind of doesn't provide enough time for them to be involved and kind of have these potentially conflicting I don't know, roles or just potential conflicts, period?
I would say, I think ultimately that's a question for those counselors. I think they tend to feel that they have plenty of work to do in their role and probably not enough time to do it. And I think on some level, many of the people on this call can identify with that in their own work. But I have found, again, in having come from Minneapolis, that the system does work very cleanly. People do tend to know their roles, and they interact with the administration in the amount that they feel comfortable or necessary. Some counselors don't ask questions at all. Some counselors ask a lot of questions, both offline and then in meetings. And so it is really a kind of choose your own adventure for those elected officials in terms of how they want to handle it. And I would say on the administration's behalf that we're here to make sure that they have what they need to be successful in their role, in however they choose to play that. And I guess, again, Chelsea, if you'd like to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, historically, we've had counselors that I think probably would have liked to have been potentially full-time, or at least to have maybe some additional staff support or additional connection at the city. But many other counselors choose not to have that level of engagement. I do think all of the counselors that I've had the opportunity to work with are fantastic about really working with their constituent base and understanding kind of that role with administration and the council. But I agree with Noah that it is certainly different counselors have approached it different ways.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. The next question is really, again, this may overlap with previous discussion, but it's about promoting accountability for the administrative staff. And to the extent that your structure may may do that? Or are there elements perhaps in a different structure that would improve accountability on behalf of the city?
I would say I think it works very well as it's set up. I think as I maybe said this earlier, but you know, I report directly to the mayor. The city attorney reports directly to the mayor. The vast majority of the remainder of the city staff report directly to me, and department heads do of the 9 department heads, 8 of them report directly to me. And so we have, I don't think that there's a lot of concern about accountability. It's something that the leadership team as a whole takes seriously. And our collective bargaining agreements like Minneapolis largely spell out how accountability is handled for line staff in terms of their day-to-day work. And then with department heads, you know, we do performance reviews and we talk regularly to set those expectations.
Great, thank you. The last question is, as you've looked at other cities, oh, there's a quick question from, or perhaps not quick, but Greg just put his hand up.
Yeah, sorry. My reputation precedes me on non-quick questions. The question I have is how much staffing does the city council have versus the mayor? I know you've talked about how the city attorney reports both to the mayor and to the council, but does the council have like its own budget staff, or does it have some sort of independent ability to like draft its own ordinances, or does that go through the city attorney's office? I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of like how much independent support for the legislative function the council may have in Duluth.
So the council itself, individual councilors do not have staff. They, as you referenced, Commissioner, they do work with the city attorney's office to draft ordinances. We certainly are available and willing and frankly hopeful that they will work with line staff to put staff perspective into any policy or ordinance change that's coming through. But they do not have specific staff. You know, as I referenced, I started my career with the city of Minneapolis as one of the policy aides for one of the Minneapolis council members. And that is just a different system than Duluth has. And so that those staff do not have, or the council does not have direct staff. Director Helmer can talk through how the city clerk's office interfaces with the council and works with them more closely than most other work groups.
Yeah, so as Noah mentioned, the council does not have dedicated staff. The city clerk's office will take on the majority of the administrative needs that counselors may have. So, travel, training, and then of course setting, working with both the council and the administration to do the general record keeping of the city. So setting the council agendas, managing board and commission appointments, that type of thing. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And just wanted to reiterate, we have a commissioner who is in transit and in the parking lot, literally. So I wanted to read her question from the chat regarding, again, it kind of works off of Commissioner Abbott's question about how many staff each council member has and if they're full or part-time. Just in general, what staff support is. And does staff report to each city council member or to the clerk? Are they part of the clerk's office?
Thank you for the question. And actually, ironically, I know Commissioner Mecke from my time as a policy aide in Councilmember Schiff's office. There are no staff for individual city councilors in Duluth. I work extensively and closely with them. Our department heads do, and Director Homer just summarized briefly how the city clerk's office works with them. And so it really is, they are not full-time counselors and they do not have staff. And so that is a big difference from Minneapolis in terms of the staff support directly available to counselors. But certainly, I just to be really clear about it, we work very hard, myself and the department heads, to make sure that counselors have staff support for conversations they need to have about whether it's about a zoning appeal or a police issue or a road repaving. If they have questions, we connect them to the appropriate staff, but we do make sure that they work through that chain of command, starting either with me or a department head, to make sure that we have a handle on what questions are being asked and make sure that we're not putting staff in a position to get direct questions from a counselor. And so that is some of the balance that we have on it.
Commissioner Mechke?
Yeah, hi Noah, nice to see you again. I'm wondering, since you're on the line, from your experience in Minneapolis, I go back far enough where the front desk staff person in Minneapolis used to be under the city clerk, and then that changed. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on pros and cons of city staff that are managed by the city clerk's office. Maybe Chelsea could answer that too. If you had city staff, what's the best approach? Because that's been a change in my time working with the city.
Commissioner Mechke, if you don't mind, I'm a little confused on your question. Staff reporting to the clerk's office, are you talking about the front desk at the council offices?
Yeah. So when I first started working with the city and neighborhoods, the front desk person was always hired by the city clerk and accountable to the city clerk, and then that changed so that the council members now hire and monitor both of their council staff support. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on pros and cons of that change, or if you were even there at the time. I can't remember how far back that change happened actually.
So thank you for that clarification. I believe that change happened after I left the council office, and I would defer to Mr. Carl for the specifics on it. I can't say that I have an opinion on it. I just did not work in the office when that was the structure as it is currently set up.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything to add, Ms. Hemler?
I do not have anything to add. The city clerk's office currently in Duluth does report directly to the city clerk, so we don't have a similar situation where they would report to individual counselors.
Okay, thank you. The last question is about how Duluth's government structure compares to other cities that you're familiar with, and if there's anything else about comparing Duluth to Minneapolis that you haven't mentioned.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we've largely covered the structure. Having worked in Minneapolis for 15 years, I can certainly see the differences. I think we've very thoroughly kind of covered them. I do think that there is a big difference, and Commissioner Abbott, I think, had mentioned this, between having all ward counselors that represent specific geographic areas and having 4 at-large counselors. And there is an interesting dynamic change there. And in part, I think it's important that that has changed. That changes the dynamic in terms of how council members and counselors look out for their specific district or ward. And then the at-large counselor, for us means that having at-large counselors means that it could be that I will hear from a district counselor on an issue and all 4 at-large counselors because they all represent the same constituency. So that is a difference that I notice. I think we've generally covered it. I don't know, Chelsea, if you'd like to add anything to that. I'm certainly happy to also answer follow-up questions if there are them.
So I am ashamed to admit that I do not know as much about the city of Minneapolis as I wish I did for the purposes of this conversation. I did have the opportunity to work with the League of Minnesota Cities. I know Commissioner Smith, and was in private legal practice where we were the city attorney for several local cities. So I'm very familiar with the statutory form of cities and cities where it's a strong council and then a city manager format. Kind of my perspective on those two is I do think that the city of Duluth strong executive administrative does allow the city to be flexible and sometimes I think provide it is easier sometimes to manage certain issues because it is able to be kept at that administrative level. That being said, I think every city is definitely unique and a lot depends on the size of the city in question. I think the statutory model works very well for a lot of smaller cities in Minnesota. And Duluth's model tends to work very well for the size of the city that it is.
And just to reiterate, the question was asked about the population of Duluth, and Mr. Shipman answered about 87,000. Do we have any that kind of does it for our list of questions. Do any other commissioners have any questions or anything to add? I think I'm trying to get my screen back. Oh, yes, Commissioner Metschke.
Thanks. I don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank the Duluth people. This is very interesting and very helpful. It's good to hear from other cities how things work. So I really appreciate their time.
Yes, I concur. Thank you very much. And
yeah, Commissioner Abbott here, I would also really like to extend my thanks for the time they've taken to answer our questions, however trivial and strange they may seem to our neighbors up north. But as we're going through this process, we do all the help we can get, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the warm welcome, and thank you for having us. We appreciate it, and happy to help if we can in the future.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much. It was great having you. All right.
Should we move to the next item on the agenda? Is that the?
Yes, I think so.
Without any objection, then we would just receive and file that report from Duluth.
No objection?
I'm sorry?
No, you just were, yes, I was, go ahead, Jill. I was, you and I were going to say this exact same thing, so go ahead.
Yes, are there any objections? Okay, we will consider that received and filed. Thank you so much, Clerk Carl. For the next agenda item, we have agenda item 4 is receiving and filing a report of interviews conducted with former elected officials of the city of Minneapolis. Following the interviews we had with department chairs. We reached out to former elected officials from the city, largely mayors and council presidents, to get their feedback about the function of the city structure. And we received the report with our meeting materials. Is there any discussion or any questions about that report? Commissioner Abbott?
I just wanted to add that this was really a unique opportunity to talk to a bunch of individuals in the same Zoom call, and it was I described it to them at the time, and I think it's very true. In some ways, it was like the best episode of Almanac ever, in terms of we did have some times where they were kind of descending into swapping war stories and whatnot, but the level of insight into how the city operates frequently from both sides of a political divide was very useful, and I thought the notes we've put together really reflect the conversation very well. And for any of and again, I would like to, the number of people that have been helpful to us in this endeavor in terms of trying to figure out how to structure a possible amendment or proposal for an amendment, has been remarkable, and the willingness of a lot of these former elected officials to take time out of their day and work through some of these issues was remarkable and very much appreciated. And I'd like to make sure that we extend our thanks to them for doing that. I think I was privileged actually to be in on that conversation. It was really remarkable. So, and that's all I wanted to say about it. Other than I think the notes that we've put together, I think really very accurately reflect the conversations we had.
Thank you. Chair Clegg?
I think that Commissioner Mechie was ahead of me, so.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I just now saw her. Commissioner Mechie?
Hi, I just wanted to say that I thought the report was very well done and very insightful. And I think it was a really good on the part of our commission to reach out and talk to people, because there are so many different experiences and so much leadership and assets out in the community. So it was a good process to read about and to follow. I'm wondering, Chair Garcia, if you want a motion to accept and receive, or if you're asking for any action on this.
A formality to accept and receive would be great. Do we need anything further, Mr. Carl?
If you wish to take a motion to receive it, you can. That's fine. We can do the roll call. You don't have to. You can just direct it to be received and filed. That's at your discretion.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from Chair Clegg.
I have nothing to add. I was just going to urge those who haven't already read it, all commissioners, whether or not on the work group, to spend some time with it. I think it will be valuable, and that we should receive and file it.
Thank you very much. I will then ask the clerk's office to receive and file the report. Now, if there's not any discussion or questions, I would like to move on to agenda item 5 on the which is receiving and filing a memo on the status and update of our information gathering work so far, including options for potential consideration related to the city's governance structure. I won't read the memo. Everybody received notification of it, but in a nutshell, I just wanted to add that we have spent time as a working group looking at some of the history of the Minneapolis Charter, reviewing comparative reports and articles about other municipal forms of government compared to Minneapolis, and interviewed leaders of the city's departments and other former electeds. And today, and at our next meeting on the 19th, we'll have been devoted to talking to other Minnesota cities of the first class. So next week it'll be Rochester and St. Cloud. Based on the work that we've done, we are considering moving forward with a more intentional look at a clarified structure where the city council is the legislative policymaking body and the mayor serves as the chief executive. So I would like to pause here for a moment and discuss with work group members as well as other charter commissioners joining us to ask the question that about if there's agreement on this course of action. Is there consensus that the charter could benefit from this level of clarity or perhaps modernization? Chair Clegg.
Thank you. I certainly agree that we should proceed down this road. As I mentioned to you before the meeting, I also think we should find a time when we can discuss in detail the summary of initial proposals that's set forth in the memo. Because I'm sure many of us will say, well, I agree with this one, but I don't agree with that one. And I think we should have a chance as a work group to have a full and fair discussion of each one to see which direction we want to go in before we put pencil to paper on a real amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ginder?
My question is kind of along those lines, and just a comment on the draft report you have right now, which has the mayor's line item veto under the executive mayor down a couple of times, which I'm assuming that's an oversight, but that, for example, is something that's not necessarily uniform amongst those cities with strong mayor systems. So that's something that's a little bit of an outlier, and based on what I read of the summary of the past Minneapolis city officials, is probably not something that they were as much in favor of. And a related question to what the path is that we're looking at is, what is the time frame that we're looking at? Is this something that we would anticipate putting on the ballot this year, or is it something that's going to take a longer amount of time to really go through? Because I suspect once we start getting into it, that we will find it's probably a little more complicated, or some of the ramifications might take some time to figure out where we're going. Just for example, talk about the city coordinator. The city coordinator really, except for showing up in the section about appointment, the duties aren't discussed at all in the city charter for the city coordinator. They're discussed heavily in special law, and that's incorporated into ordinance. So, how we want to, look at that. How is the city coordinator like the city manager, or whichever way we want to go? Some of those are going to be kind of complex questions if you go down that route. Others might be somewhat more simple. But I think, depending on the time frame, also kind of tells us what we're looking at.
I think for right now, that's a very good question. We have looked at the timeline. I believe it was in the November 5th meeting, a timeline, perhaps October 20th meeting. Yes, the October 20th meeting. There was a draft, a timeline presented for potential ballot questions, which indicates that we should have to make a formal amendment in time for the 2021 election. We would have to have something, a draft amendment finalized and ready for formal action at the beginning of February. So that's to your first question. To your second question about scope, I think perhaps having the conversation that Chair Clegg suggested about spending some time talking about these options may lead to a discussion of scope. Right now, I know we have just looked at council members and the mayor. There hasn't been a lot of discussion around any other structural options beyond that. As you mentioned, you were talking about city coordinator. So perhaps that's something that we should discuss further and agree upon or define or see if that should be in our scope to proceed. Does that make sense?
Madam Chair, it does. And I'm aware of what we had originally set out as the timeline. Is at some point the timeline may or may not be realistic depending on the nature of the changes that we're talking about. Both thinking them through and then having that explored with outside agencies or getting other input besides our own input on the actual changes. And that will often vary. We'll have to wait until what the exact language is. It's one thing to talk about an executive mayor system. It's another thing to actually look at what we've drafted and trying to figure out what the actual ramifications are.
Thank you. Commissioner Abbott?
Yeah, on the time frame question, we are obviously just a work group, essentially a subcommittee of the Charter Commission as a whole, and whatever work product we present to the Charter Commission, we have to get to them in time for them to go through their process. And if the commission as a whole wants to proceed, we're going to have public hearings, and there's going to be some lead time there. So our goal has been to get, if we are going to produce a proposed amendment, to do a report and a proposed amendment in February, which should give the commission as a whole a good 2 or 3 months to hold public hearings and to kick around potentially its own amendments to what's going on. In terms of the kind of the larger question of what's included and in a lot of the details. The problem, of course, when you do a charter amendment is that it becomes kind of this catch-all for everybody's suggestion for how to improve city government. And you could spend a lot of time, I think, chasing down various specific proposals of what's going on. I would like to come forward on the 19th in 2 weeks, and I think we'll have a draft proposal to look at. And my goal is essentially I wouldn't describe it as minimalist per se, but I want to kind of narrow it down to what I think are the essential problems, with some of the things that we've heard from city staff, some of the things we've heard from the former electeds. Of course, we also have to hear from the current elected officials as well. That's still on our to-do list in order to get their input first. But I would like to I'd like to get that down, and I certainly don't want to. I've gotten contacted by a couple of private citizens and some other people, and so there's been some email chatter about what about this and what about that and the other thing. I think there's an infinite regress problem here. I don't want to prevent us from actually producing a proposal for the commission as a whole to consider. We could. I want to avoid paralysis by analysis here, and hopefully the commission as a whole will agree with that. But at any rate, yeah, I think we're going to have some specific text to look at in a couple of weeks, and I think the goal of putting this on the agenda today is to get you guys and the rest of the work group and perhaps some other commissioners to start thinking about specific language about how to implement some of these initial proposals. What language you think would be appropriate, what language you think might not be appropriate for the initial proposals. So if we can all put on our thinking caps and get out our drafting pencils over the next couple of weeks, I think that would be a helpful use of time.
Thank you, Commissioner Abbott. Chair Clay?
I know at our meeting on the 19th, we expect to hear from St. Paul and Rochester, and I think that'll be very valuable, but I also think it'll probably take up all our meeting time. I think we need a dedicated meeting to going through some of these things, like, do we really want a line item veto? Do we really want this? Do we really want that? And I don't think we can figure that we're going to fit it in on the 19th. I would suggest we try and hold another meeting of the work group perhaps next week, so that we can actually have that conversation with nothing else on the agenda, so we can make sure we get input from everybody on the work group and get our drafting instructions set. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Clegg. Any reactions to having a specific work group, a specific meeting for the work group next week to discuss this? Commissioner Abbott?
I think it's an excellent idea, and I think we should go ahead and schedule a meeting unless there's an objection.
Is there any objection? Commissioner Smith?
I just had a question. I guess I don't disagree with the memo. It's kind of geared towards what I would call a strong mayor form of government, which I think may make the most sense. I guess I was just wondering how much you might have considered other forms, in particular, kind of a city manager form of government. It seems like that's kind of the other big one that a lot of cities that we're hearing from use. And I guess I'm just wondering if that was considered specifically and if there was a reason why you selected kind of the strong mayor form over that.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. What I can speak to is the charge that the Charter Commission gave us, which is to look at our current charter, and within that, the purview of the mayor and city council. Since we don't have a city manager position, and again, really looking at what of the current charter and as narrow as possible. I think we've all agreed and mentioned this, that if we were writing a charter from scratch now, there'd be many things that we would be able to change and tweak and improve in the charter. But given where we are now, given, again, the fact that the Minneapolis charter has been kind of less than perfect since it's been cobbled together by ordinance and such to come into being, that if we were going to kind of approach the simplistic road and just address what is within the charter itself, that's really what we were looking at. Commissioner Abbott.
Yeah, I just want to second I'm not sure that a city manager proposal is within the grant of power that we got from the Charter Commission as a whole. I mean, I think that the specific resolution authorizing this work group was evaluate the balance of power between the council and the mayor. Maybe the Commission as a whole, if somebody wants to raise this at our general meeting tomorrow, perhaps you want to, I mean, I'm not advocating that we expand that, but if that's an important thing. I can tell you from my personal standpoint, I think I don't think a city manager system works for larger cities. It seems to be for smaller or medium-sized cities, it seems to work pretty well, but particularly in a situation like Minneapolis, where we seem to value transparency and kind of democratic accountability, I think you're going to get a different kind of conversation. You're going to get a different level of objection to a charter change if it's the city manager system. Former council member and council president Paul Ostro and some other folks about 10 years ago, ran the city manager proposal up the flagpole, and it didn't seem to really get much traction. So I think in lieu of fighting that fight over again, my concept is we have a city that has administrative problems. We really do have a 14 boss problem. And I think my perspective is that we should kind of address as minimally as narrowly tailored as possible to fix that problem is what my proposal is kind of aimed at, and or my concept of a proposal is kind of aimed at. And I think the more we broaden the scope, the more we kind of throw stuff in there, I think the more we kind of lose the focus on the 14 boss problem, and we end up debating kind of these theoretical debates about, city manager versus city coordinator versus city administrator. What do those mean? And I think a lot of these questions, I thought it was interesting in the Duluth comments today, because I think a lot of those questions can be answered or solved by ordinance. The council certainly has the ability to pass an ordinance governing how the city departments are organized, even in a even in a system, an executive mayor or legislative council system. And I don't want to, like I say, I don't want to kind of, create this giant gumball of ideas and then have it be too unwieldy. I think we need to present something. If we do present something to the voters, I think it needs to be trim, narrowly tailored, and solves the problem that we've been developing evidence for. So, I mean, I think the report of the department heads, I think, was a clear sign that we needed to have like one administrative head to whom city employees can report. And the bigger the more we get away from that focus, I think I think the debate shifts, and I think we'd get ahead of ourselves if we did that. So that's kind of my reaction.
Thank you.
And I guess I wasn't necessarily advocating for a city manager. I guess I just wanted to kind of know your thoughts and answer that. So.
Well, I mean, I can only speak for myself, and perhaps Jill and I have had some conversations. I mean, if there is, I mean, certainly this is the Charter Commission as a whole is going to get to vote on this, right? So it's like, and as a matter of fact, the work group, all six of us are going to get to vote on this, right? So if somehow I've missed this groundswell for a city manager system, we can certainly fix it at this point in the process. I'm not thrilled by the concept. So.
And before going on to Commissioner Metschke, I would say thank you, Commissioner Smith. As we have this conversation, if there are things that are kind of outside of this scope that Commissioner Abbott just spoke to, we can definitely put in a parking lot and look at in our final report if there are things we may recommend or options we may want to put up there for the city's consideration in the future. Commissioner Metschke.
Thank you, Co-Chair Garcia. Well, I was going to say the exact same thing that you said. Going back to Commissioner Ginder's comments, I wonder too, there's always going to be a reaction to every action that's happening, and it may occur, it may occur that having more of a defined scope for a city manager or a city coordinator is going to be a future topic. I think that Commissioner Clegg's suggestion for another meeting is really good, because I think there's a lot of conversation that we can have about this with our work group and with the full group. Going back to when we revised the charter, there was always the intent that we wanted to do some substantial changes, because a lot of that came up through the public hearings while we were revising the charter. And one of the things that I think about often is what I raised with Noah today too, is, how constituent services are handled at the council offices. And, I don't know if that's a process, if that's something that could be set in stone. Does the city clerk hire and manage at least one person in every council office so that there's continuity, so that there is institutional memory from one person to the next? I think back of the days before that was changed, and there was really solid constituent service. Not that we don't have it now, but I'm just saying, it seemed like it was I don't know, something that I'd like to talk more about with our city clerk and in this group down the road, but we could just do it step by step.
Yeah, I think that's, pardon me for stepping in. I think that's a really good point. I mean, we don't have to do everything all at once. I mean, the Charter Commission will continue to exist, and additional proposals can be debated and submitted, right? I think, because Minneapolis has been really slow to do charter reform in the past, we've had a lot of proposals that have died. I think there's kind of this temptation, like, well, if there's a real chance this year, let's pump everything we can into the one proposal. And I think that's exactly the wrong idea, which is, I think, partly why some of the previous efforts have failed. It's, St. Paul, for example, went to a kind of a strong mayor executive system in 1970, and then went through they went to a part-time council in 1985. Now, I don't think a part-time council is ever going to fly in Minneapolis, but the point of my using that example is there are a lot of ways we can tweak down the road what happens here. We can do technical amendments down the road with subsequent proposals to the voters, and this is not the final word on how this is going to look. So I think that what we need to do is we need to take the first step to kind of get out of this organizational morass that we're in. And then once having done that, having stopped digging the hole that we're in, once we get back to ground level, we can kind of look around and maybe after this process, look at, some technical fine adjustments. But for this process, for this amendment, I think we ought to just do what we need to do and not load it up with more than we need to do.
Well, and also in addition to, I think Commissioner Mechke hits on a good point with regard to staffing and supporting the council, which is one of the options we listed on the memo, is to be able to, and also as we look at this, I think we're really looking at city council strong as the legislative body and the mayor as the executive, having the two really balance each other and complementing each other rather than having an imbalance of authority or power between the two. And looking at the question, do we have the support that the council would need in order to do the full breadth of policymaking and constituent services that it is really good at, that is its strength, and really looking at playing to the strengths of each of these functions to really, again, help them complement one another so the city governance can really come together to focus on city goals and what's best to the overall city. And I think by making some of these clarifications in the charter, we would hope to kind of ameliorate some of these stepping on toes and things like maybe mission creep when it comes to oversight on certain issues. Sometimes, a council member may say, oh, we have authority over this, but then when it comes to an issue of accountability, they can perhaps kind of backtrack because that is how the charter is set up. The charter's not clear on those levels of accountability. And in order to have clear roles and functions, we need to have clear staffing. One thing, as time goes on, I will call on Commissioner Mechke, but I wanted to throw out next Thursday on the 14th as a potential meeting that we can dedicate to this discussion. Commissioner Mechke.
Yeah, I just was going to add on to your conversation, some other thoughts that are going through my head when I read the reports that have been developed, and I think about what the different staff are saying. It goes back to Commissioner Ginder's question, I think. And down the road, this will have to be a part of a functional governance, but the city coordinator's office too. Who's in the coordinator's office? What projects are happening out of there? How is it staffed? How are they working with department heads? How are they coordinating and communicating with other council members? That coordinator's office has a lot going on and a lot of stuff that's happening, and it'd be interesting to know how that interfaces with the department heads, how it fits into their work plans, thinking about what Noah had said about clear roles and clear communication. I just would like to park that somewhere too, Commissioner Garcia, clarity on projects and roles out of the coordinator's office, and how does that fit in with everything else going on in the city with the department heads?
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mechke. We don't necessarily have a hard stop. Do we have any Is there any conflicts with having a meeting to discuss this, to discuss these options and further on the 14th? Okay, we can go ahead and save that date and ask the clerk's office to send out a meeting with that. Commissioner Abbott.
I assume we're talking about 4:30 on the 14th.
Yes. Is there any other comments? Are there any other questions? Anything that somebody wants to throw out to kind of think about and roll over in our minds before next Thursday? Chair Clegg.
I would just suggest that you consider as agenda for the meeting just the items that are listed in your memorandum under summary of initial proposals. And there are 6 of them. And that we just go through them one by one and see where there is agreement and where there is not.
That sounds good. Does that sounds like it works for everyone?
Yes.
Commissioner Smith? Okay, you're nodding.
Yes, that works.
Sometimes nodding or a thumbs up is easier than unmuting. And Commissioner Metchke? Not seeing you weigh in. I hope
I'm okay. I'm
Okay,
okay
good.
with it.
Good. Sounds good. Yes, so we will meet next Thursday at 4:30, go through the summary of initial proposals one by one, what we like, what we don't like, perhaps elements which are redeemable that we can look at applying. And I think that about covers it. Are there anything is there anything unsaid or anything I may have forgotten? Okay, I think we are, we've gotten our directions, we've done our information gathering, and we are now officially rolling up our sleeves, and I look forward to a very productive meeting next week. Commissioner Abbott, you came on.
I just want to say thanks for everybody, and I don't know that we'll actually have a draft debate next week, but I would encourage people to think about, as you go through the item of 6 proposals that we put together, give some thought to, go back to the charter and give some thought to the language that would implement that. Because I think one of the things I'll probably have, I don't know that I'll have it in the form of a document, but I think when we go through these items one by one, I think I'll have some suggestions for the kind of text that I'm looking for to kind of achieve those objectives. And so it's time to get out the dictionaries and the thesauruses and dig up your
Elements of style.
Elements of style, sentence diagramming. That's what we need to start thinking about. So, and thanks to everybody for their time. And I guess we'll see you all next Thursday.
Yes. Commissioner Hawkins?
I just want to make a clarifying on something. I got a calendar request for tomorrow. Is there a meeting tomorrow?
Tomorrow is the meeting of the full Charter Commission.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yes, and we look forward, I believe that's your first full meeting of the Charter Commission. So we look forward to introducing you then.
Thank you.
Well, with that, I believe we have concluded all business to come before the governance structure work group of the commission. So without objection, we stand adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.